So, good evening. A very good proof of your courage you have already given by being here, despite of the awful rain. I'm not really sure if this counts like a real proof of courage. Edward will tell us more of that. Maybe you have something else in mind. Very warm welcome to all of you for this lecture at the Institute for Human Sciences. I'm Ludgar Hagedorn, working here at the Institute as a permanent fellow. And I'm very much looking forward to what promises to be a highly interesting talk and on a highly interesting topic. It includes philosophy, it includes to some degree military history, I would say. But if I would look for the best word to describe what we're going to speak about today, I would use the old-fashioned German word Sittengeschichte. Which inadequately translates as moral history, but maybe means more like history of mores, history of customs, maybe even history of manners. I think this is what we're going to speak a lot about tonight. As you will also find out in the talk, it is very much a lecture about manly attitudes, manly manners, and manly self-perceptions. It is a bit unfortunate that with this topic we also have three men sitting here talking to you. So I think, Volha, it's maybe upon you in the discussion to take care of the female intervention. So there's this big responsibility on you tonight. So very warm welcome to all of you. Our speaker of tonight is Edward Skidelsky. Edward, we are very happy that you are a guest of the Institute currently. Edward is a philosopher teaching at the University of Exeter. His first big book, which I think also was his dissertation, was on Ernst Cassirer. The title is Ernst Cassirer, The Last Philosopher of Culture. And one thing that always comes to mind when speaking about Ernst Cassirer is obviously his debate with Heidegger in Davos, 1929. And relating it to the topic of today, I would also say that this was also a kind of battle, and not just a battle of ideas, but also a battle of attitude, also a battle of manners. Maybe there's even a line from this book to what you're talking about tonight. Edward, you have also published in 2012 with Penguin, together with Robert Skidelsky, the book How Much Is Enough? Work, Money, and The Good Life, it was entitled. And in preparation you have a book on the languages of virtues, which has very much to do with the topic of your talk of today. Megalopsychia, the greatness of soul. Virtue is one of the greatnesses of soul. Your interests are virtue ethics, I would say, and maybe also ethics and economy. And one thing I found about you on the website, maybe you would be willing to speak about it a bit more afterwards in the discussion, is that you are taking care of a website that is dedicated to the so-called virtues of the dead. That is, you're collecting epitaphs from churches and cathedrals. And the main idea, the main question behind it is, how did people historically commemorate the departed? What kind of virtues did they especially like about the departed? I find this a highly interesting topic, and I would be really curious to hear a bit more, if possible, in the discussion about it. I'm also very happy that we have Aner Barzilay, who is our visiting fellow for the first half, more or less, roughly, of 2022 at IWM. Aner, it has been a pleasure. It is a pleasure to have you here at the Institute. It's very great that you're commenting today. Aner has written his dissertation on Michel Foucault, and what he's working on about now is, in some sense, a follow-up project to this dissertation, dedicated to questions of historicity surrounding today's contemporary debate of the so-called Anthropocene. That is, the title is Thinking Historically in the Age of Climate Change. A very great thanks to sorry?
Climate crisis.
Climate crisis, sorry. Climate crisis, yeah. A very great thank you to both of you. Edward, Aner, Edward, please.
All right. Thank you very much. So, courage. What is courage? Well, clearly it has something to do with the overcoming of fear. But fear of what? and to what end? Analytic philosophers believe that there are final answers to these questions. They believe that there is such a thing as the concept of courage, which might, with a bit of effort, be discovered and described. In this, they are hopelessly deluded. Our modern concept of courage is the product of a highly specific and contingent history, different stages of which are still inchoately present in our current use of the term. To understand what courage is for us now, we have to know the entire story of how it came to be. Conceptual analysis implies historical analysis. Prior to the revolution that we call modernity, there were essentially two models of courage. There was the courage of daring self-assertion, as exemplified by Achilles and Alexander the Great, and there was the courage of steadfast endurance, as exemplified by Socrates and then later Christ. Which of these two models had priority was a matter of ongoing debate. But on 2 points there was agreement. First, courage was physical. That is, it related not to fear in general, but to fear of bodily injury and death specifically. And second, it was a quality supremely valuable and desirable in itself, quite apart from any good intentions or consequences it might have. Ancient rhetoric associated it with what the Greeks called megalopsychaia and the Romans magnanimitas, literally greatness of soul. Of course, courage in warrior societies was also vitally useful, but it was not just useful or primarily useful. It was first and foremost glorious. Today, both these assumptions have been abandoned. Courage is viewed as primarily moral, not physical, and as valuable only insofar as it intends or brings about some benefit to the public. Most of us would, I think, agree with the 18th century Scottish philosopher Francis Hutchinson that mere courage or contempt of danger, if we conceive it to have no regard for the defense of innocence or repairing of wrongs, would entitle its possessor only to bedlam. Courage has been subordinated to morality, the all-encompassing system of rights and duties which governs our social world. It has, as we might say, been defanged. So how and why did this change come about? That's the question I want to answer in tonight's talk. So my story begins in late medieval Italy, where the growth of the money economy led to a gradual weakening of feudal obligation. Increasingly, mercenaries made up the core of princely armies, while commercial republics like Florence and Venice relied entirely on mercenaries for their defense. But mercenaries brought troubles of their own. Having no overriding interest in victory, their efforts on the battlefield tended to be half-hearted, and in the intervals between wars, they lived off the surrounding countryside, pillaging, burning, and raping. Often they turned tables on their paymasters. By the 15th century, many mercenary contractors or condottieri had established themselves as rulers in their own right, snuffing out the freedoms of the medieval communi. Machiavelli, steeped in antiquity, saw in all this a likeness of the turbulent last years of the Roman Republic, when hired armies had ravaged the peninsula before finally handing power to Augustus. Mercenaries, he concluded, were the death of liberty. If Florentines wished to be free again, they must do their fighting themselves, as had the Romans of an earlier, nobler epoch. But alas, centuries of commerce had rendered them soft and selfish. Wealth, not glory, now engrossed their minds. Here too, Machiavelli saw a parallel with the ancient world, where addiction to money-making and other arts of peace had time and again sapped nations of their virtu, leaving them prey to poorer, hardier neighbors. As he put it, paraphrasing the Greek historian Polybius, valor begets tranquility, tranquility ease, ease disorder, and disorder ruin. And conversely, out of ruin springs order, from order valor, and thence glory and good fortune. There was no reason in his mind for this cycle of decadence and renewal ever to end. If one enemy of valor was commerce, another was Christianity. Our religion, wrote Machiavelli, wants you to have the capacity to endure suffering more than to undertake brave deeds. It has glorified meekness and humility, making the world soft and weak. Machiavelli doesn't quite say what his 19th century admirer Nietzsche was to say, that Christian fortitude is just a fig leaf for impotence, but the thought might have occurred to him. Certainly, his preference was for the rival courage of brave deeds, which he associates in classical style with the male sex. It's better to be impulsive than cautious, runs the famous passage in The Prince, for fortune is female, and if you want to stay on top of her, you have to slap and thrust. You'll see she's more likely to yield that way than to men who go about her coldly. And being a woman, she likes her men young, because they're not so cagey. They're wilder and more daring when they master her. And this is from a recent translation of The Prince by Tim Parks, which really tries to bring out the violence and liveliness of the Italian original. It's easy to overlook the novelty of what Machiavelli is doing here. Courage in antiquity was certainly a manly quality, but it had nothing especially to do with slap and thrust, not even metaphorically. Its sphere of action was the battlefield, not the bedroom. Its great exemplars were Heracles and Achilles, not the pretty boy Paris. Machiavelli was the first writer of note to make courage a matter of both military and sexual audacity, forging an association of ideas which was to echo powerfully down the centuries. This was chauvinism, to be sure, but it was also a backhanded tribute to the elevated status of women in the early modern period. It was only in an age when women were looked up to as ladies that their seduction could be understood as a trial of courage comparable to war. Paris didn't have to worry what Helen thought of him. Her opinion was neither here nor there. But, to return to the main theme, Machiavelli's hopes of reviving the citizen armies of antiquity were vain. Modern Florentines were not about to become ancient Romans, not because they were at a different stage in some endlessly recurring cycle, but because their whole pattern of life was different. They were artisans and merchants, not slave-owning warriors. To expect them to act like these latter was, as Machiavelli's friend Guicciardini put it, to expect asses to run like horses. In any case, wars were by this time of a complexity and duration intimidating to amateurs. Florence's own militia, raised and trained by Machiavelli himself when he was Chancery Secretary, folded smartly under the assault of professional Spanish troops at Prato in 1512. The German militias created in the run-up to the 30 Years' War proved equally unfit for service. Mercenaries dominated the great princely armies of the 16th and 17th centuries. Encircled by sea, England was able to cling on to its illusions of citizenly virtu somewhat longer than its continental rivals. Here, the old Shire militia remained in active service, manning garrisons and quelling local disturbances, tasks it discharged with adequate competency. It never had to face a professional army on home soil. As a result, the English remained wedded to the militia ideal long after other nations had given up on it. The principal point of greatness in any state is to have a race of military men, wrote Bacon in 1612. Walled towns, stored arsenals and armories, goodly races of horse, chariots of war, elephants, ordnance, artillery, and the like, all this is but sheep in lion's skin, except the breed and disposition of the people be stout and warlike. The Civil War exposed the hollowness of these maxims. Stout and warlike the men of England may have been, prepared for the rigors of modern combat they were not. Muddle and indecision marked the early years of the war. Victory, when it came, was the offspring not of superior virtu, but of Cromwell's success in establishing a professional army on the European model. Charles II took the lesson to heart. He disbanded Cromwell's army, but made sure to retain the best part of it, the Coldstream Guards they were later called, as part of his enlarged household division. These were paid forces, so in that sense mercenaries, but unlike older mercenaries, they were permanently embodied, thoroughly drilled, and loyal to the crown. They formed the nucleus of what was to become the British Army, the mainstay of British power on the continent and in the colonies. The creation of the British Army set a seal on the deepest of the many divisions of labour which characterise modernity, the division between those who fight and those who don't. Once, fighting had been an activity proper to all free men or noblemen. Now it was reserved to small bands of professional soldiers, set apart by manners and way of life from the civilian majority. Deprived of its old martial function, the nobility hung up its weapons on the wall as ornaments and turned its castles into residential seats. They were of no military value anyway by this time. Some, faithful to family tradition, took commissions in the new regiments, but such authority as they now possessed was by virtue of their office, not name. Others shunned war altogether. Asked by a young lord what had become of the military spirit of the old English nobility, Dr. Johnson replied, "Why, my lord, I'll tell you what has become of it. It has gone into the city to look for a fortune." In this new pacified state of society, valour and military prowess ceased to be, in Keith Thomas's words, moral qualities expected of all men of ambition, and tended instead to be regarded as more akin to the technical qualifications of an occupational group. Matters are not quite so straightforward as this last quotation suggests, however. Post-Restoration England may have outgrown the anarchy of the Middle Ages, but by modern standards it was still an extremely violent place. There was no police force and no effectively enforced law of slander or libel. Each man's person, property, and honour were his to defend. Fighters were admired, shirkers despised. Punch-ups were common and clearly much enjoyed. There was a quarrel between a gentleman and a waiter, wrote Boswell in 1763. A great crowd gathered round and roared out, a ring, which is the signal for making room for the parties to box it out. He once had a quarrel with a waterman at Hungerford Stairs, wrote William Hazlitt of a celebrated fives player, and, they say, served him out in great style. With attitudes like this, it is hardly surprising that homicides were much more common than they are today, and that they more often arose from quarrels, frequently trivial, between unrelated men. As for the violence inflicted by men on women, most of it unrecorded, since it wasn't classified as criminal, it is incalculable. Today, we think of casual violence as the preserve of lower-class roughs. But in the early modern period, it was more typical of noblemen, whose Viking spirit had not yet evanesced entirely. Restoration Londoners were familiar with the sight of young aristocrats marauding through town, smashing windows and beating up anyone in sight. Scouring, this sport was called. Gentlemen wore weapons until at least the 1770s, and would use them too. William Harvey, discoverer of the circulation of the blood, is said by Aubrey to have been too apt to draw his dagger upon any slight occasion. Charles Lamb, growing up in London in the 1780s, recalls his father dodging a thrust from a swordsman whom he had taken to task for insulting a lady. No wonder gentlemen were overrepresented in 18th century London homicide cases by a factor of 3 to 5. Noble feuds in 16th century England tended to be rough and messy affairs involving scores of friends, relatives, and retainers. Think of Romeo and Juliet. The Code of Honour, imported from France in the early 17th century, aimed to stop this kind of escalation by restricting fighting to the two principal antagonists and regulating its forms. The result was that strangest of aristocratic rituals, the duel. No one actually approved of dueling. The law condemned it. Churchmen and moralists railed against it. But the code was inexorable. Insults could not honourably be ignored, nor challenges declined. This was well understood by jurymen, who in those rare cases that duellists were brought to court, showed themselves unwilling to convict them. When dueling did finally die out in the early 19th century, it was due less to changes in law or religion than to a new understanding of what it means to display courage, as we'll see in a moment. There were other ways besides brawling and dueling for a young man of the world to establish his credentials. There were games of chance, played, as one 18th century historian has put it, not so much to win money as to demonstrate a prowess superior to that of one's opponent. And then, of course, there was seduction, Machiavelli's paradigm of manly boldness. This was a source of much overwrought humour, as in this 1717 account of a tryst in a coach. She handled his arms, and finding them not fit for present service, beat him up heartily. He said all he could for himself, telling her that he had been upon hard duty for some time in the wars of Venus, and if she would give him but one day to recruit on, he would behave himself like a man. She minded not his excuses, but turned him out of the coach and gave him this advice: never to attack a handsome young lady as she was when his ammunition was spent. And there are endless jokes on this theme. Such wars might indeed be dangerous, but that was all part of the thrill. Who in the performance of a manly part would not wish to get clap, wrote William Cochrane, Judge Advocate of Scotland, to his friend James Boswell. The brave only are wounded in front, and heroes are not ashamed of such scars. The middle classes were unimpressed. From their point of view, aristocratic honour was nothing but an excuse for bad behaviour. Even its language was a con, as lexicographers delighted in pointing out. A brave was a hectoring fellow, a swaggerer. Gallantry was fornication and adultery. But let's not be too hard on the braves and the gallants. Perhaps some of them really were brave and gallant, yet under peaceful conditions, these virtues could find no other outlet, save in brawling, gambling, and womanizing. Unemployed manliness, as Harvey Mansfield has called it, was, and is, a condition inseparable from the progress of civilization. The persistence of aristocratic violence in an otherwise law-governed realm seemed to many an intolerable anomaly, a relic of Gothic barbarism. But what could be done about it? The problem was that this violence sprang directly from the obligation, binding on all men of honour, to respond courageously to insults and injuries. If it was to be eliminated, a radical rethinking of traditional ideas of courage was first of all called for. Courage is the virtue which overcomes fear. But what if fear is best not overcome? What if it is a passion well suited to civilize men, to make them peaceful and obedient? Machiavelli famously claimed that the wise prince rules by fear, not love. Hobbes, building on him, made fear a foundation not just of princely rule, but of civil government as such. For if fear precipitates the war of all against all, it also brings an end to that war by persuading us to give up our power of defense to Leviathan. Fear is both the poison and the antidote, both the chief source of strife and the first tie of civil society. It is not from love that we come together in cities and kingdoms, but from fear of what fear might make us do to each other if we don't. What then of courage? Given his hedonistic psychology, Hobbes cannot allow that there might be any such thing as a real overcoming of fear. So he defines courage idiosyncratically as an effect of fear itself, as, quote, an opinion of hurt from the object with hope of avoiding that hurt by resistance. Thus understood, courage is intrinsically neither virtuous nor vicious. It is simply one means to the end of self-preservation, the fight side of the fight or flight response. It may serve us well enough in a state of nature, but in a civil state, where we have no reason to expect hurt or to think that we can avoid hurt by resistance, it can do only mischief. Courage is still required in soldiers, nations being in a posture of war vis-à-vis one another. But for the civilian population, the less they dare, the better it is, both for the Commonwealth and themselves. Hobbes's high opinion of fear was shared by many in the centuries following him. The only useful passion that man is possessed of towards the peace and quiet of his society is his fear, wrote Mandeville in 1714, and the more you work on it, the more orderly and governable he'll be. Hence, bravery out of an army is highly injurious to the public, For if a man could conquer all his fears, you would hear of nothing but rapes, murders, and violences of all sorts. Dr. Johnson agreed. Mutual courage keeps us in peace, he told Boswell in 1778, tongue only partly in cheek. Were all brave, they would lead a very uneasy life. All would be continually fighting, but being all cowards, we get on very well. This new evaluation of courage brought with it a new perspective on history. The heroes of antiquity, for so long the idols of ambitious youth, were now excoriated as no better than so many glorious robbers and illustrious plunderers, born to be the scourges and plagues of mankind. Alexander the Great was singled out for particular criticism. No benefit of his people, nor welfare of the public, seems to have ever entered his thoughts, wrote the author of the Female Tatler. All the end he had in conquering was that people should say he had conquered. Alexander Pope made the same observation in verse. Heroes are much the same, the points agreed, from Macedonia's madman to the Swede. The whole strange purpose of their lives to find or make an enemy of all mankind. So public utility was displacing personal greatness as the touchstone of moral worth. But courage was too central, too prestigious a value to be simply jettisoned. An alternative interpretation of it was called for, and one lay ready to hand in Christianity. Theologians had always depreciated military courage in favor of what Milton called the better fortitude of patience and heroic martyrdom. The 18th century reiterated this judgment, though now for reasons that were more Hobbesian than scriptural. Valor or active courage can never be a Christian virtue, wrote author and parliamentarian Soame Jenyns, for it is the usual perpetrator of all the violences which from retaliated injuries distract the world with bloodshed and devastation. Passive courage, on the other hand, is indeed frequently and properly inculcated by our meek and suffering religion under the titles of patience and resignation. Tombstone epitaphs of the period frequently commend the deceased for his, or more usually her, extraordinary fortitude under suffering. A sublime pattern of divine patience under ye tortures of ye stone, runs the epitaph of Elizabeth Rawlinson, who died in 1691. No cause of grief, no pain or sickness could extort a complaint from her, runs that of Mary Marrow, who died in 1714. But for all the sermonizing on its behalf, Christian fortitude remained an ambiguous virtue. Resignation in illness and in the face of death were universally admired, but the specifically Christian element in Christian fortitude, putting up with insults and injuries, had no appeal for men of rank or ambition, whose honor lay precisely in not putting up with insults and injuries. To them, forbearance could signify only cowardice. And even if they had wished to turn the other cheek, a humiliating consciousness of how such conduct would be perceived by others made it practically impossible for them. I commit my soul to Almighty God, wrote one Colonel Thomas the night before a duel, in hopes of his mercy and pardon for the irreligious step I now, in compliance with the unwarrantable customs of the wicked world, put myself under the necessity of taking. He was killed the next day. Clearly, it was pointless to preach Christian forgiveness to men like Colonel Thomas, whose lives were governed by a strictly contrary set of values. To wean such men from violence, it had to be shown that courage itself, true courage, lay in forbearance, not retaliation. How could this be done? It was beneath his dignity. It lowered him and was more or less ridiculous. That was one contemporary's verdict on Prime Minister Wellington's 1829 challenge to Lord Winchelsea, an undistinguished earl who had insulted him in the press. 3 decades earlier, Lord Justice Kenyon had similarly urged the prosecutor in a dueling suit to think, in recollecting what was past, that there was more dignity in overlooking the offence than in punishing it. Here was an interesting development. Once honour had obliged gentlemen to fight. Now dignity was calling on them not to. Honour and dignity are concepts from the same neck of the woods, Only whereas honor demands recognition from others, dignity gets on fine without it, confident that, as the old jingle says, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. This was an ancient Stoic attitude, given new force by the modern picture of the mind as a self-contained substance, invulnerable to what it doesn't know or care about. It was not a strictly Christian attitude. To overlook an offense is, after all, not to forgive it. It is an act of pride, not love, of greatness, not humility. In short, this was a manly attitude, and as such acceptable to gentlemen like Colonel Thomas, who were never going to be persuaded to turn the other cheek. From the standpoint of dignity, sensitivity to honor is a somewhat infantile trait. It shows a weak and vain mind, preoccupied with matters of no real importance. It might even show cowardice, inasmuch as its hidden motive is fear of the judgment of others. Real courage lies in what Lord Erskine, a prominent anti-dualist, called daring to be void of offence, daring to obey the law of the land, and spurning at these notions of honor, as they are falsely called. This was the characteristic point of view of those enlightened middle-class officials who shaped public opinion during the era of reform. Under their influence, dueling became increasingly infra dig, finally dying out altogether. The last recorded duel in England was fought in 1852 by two émigré French revolutionaries, one of them an ex-convict. By 1865, it was possible for John Cam Hobhouse to list dueling alongside bull-baiting, prize-fighting, cock-fighting, and other barbarous usages. Violence had begun its long descent down the ladder of moral and social respectability. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the conceptual transformation implied by this development. In the pre-modern world, as I said, courage, whether of the active or passive variety, had always related to fear of bodily injury and ultimately of death. But beginning in the 18th century, that sort of courage started to be deprecated as a mere accident of nature, with no more claim to merit than strength or beauty. In its place, moral courage, a new coinage meaning readiness to face down social disapproval in the performance of what one believes to be one's duty, was installed as the central form of the virtue. Courage was thereby annexed to what Kant called autonomy, obedience to a law which one gives to oneself. Dueling was a test case. What shows more courage? Courting death by accepting a challenge, or dishonor by refusing it? The answer wasn't obvious. The introduction of conscription in 1916 provided another case in point. Conscientious objectors were often accused of cowardice, but from the standpoint of moral courage, they could plausibly claim the high ground. After all, it took some nerve to put up with all that scorn. Moral courage baffled traditionalists. From their point of view, fearlessness in the face of loss of reputation did not look like courage at all. Someone who fears this is a decent person and has a sense of shame, wrote Aristotle, whereas one who does not fear it is shameless. Aristotle spoke for a culture in which the self was indistinguishable from its social roles, so that to fail in those roles was to risk a loss of identity worse even than death. But in our culture, where the self and its roles have come apart, refusal to play the good wife, good son, good citizen, etc., can be seen as one form, indeed the highest form, of courage. Our representative hero is the artist or intellectual, braving abuse in fidelity to his or her own vision of the truth. Moral courage is an inspiring ideal, but it is also prone, as physical courage is not, to a curious kind of corruption. Since the risks it runs are immaterial, anyone with a modicum of ingenuity or gall can claim it for himself. George Orwell, a man of physical as well as moral courage, had no patience with this maneuver. To be a conchi during World War I took some guts, he wrote in a doggerel poem of 1943. But now, when every writer finds his niche within some mutual admiration clique, who cares what epitaphs by blimps are hurled? who'd give a damn if given a white feather? Each little mob of pansies is a world, cozy and warm in any kind of weather. In such a world, it's easy to object, since that's what both your friends and foes expect. Today, this kind of moral grandstanding goes still further. It takes huge courage to speak out in support of trans people in Britain in 2021, tweeted one Guardian journalist at the start of that year, presumably with himself in mind. The truth, of course, is that it takes no courage at all, especially for Guardian journalists. Real courage must, we feel, be more or less extinct for such a debased use of the term to pass muster. But, for all its faults, moral courage is the only form of that virtue consistent with the central fact of modern political life, the monopoly of violence by the state. Physical courage implies a rejection of that monopoly. Its modern archetypes are street fighters, gangsters, and warlords, fantasy figures for many, but not models of real-life conduct. Only in the army and a few other institutions does physical courage retain its right, and even here, its meaning has changed essentially. In the classical tradition, as I said, courage was valued for reasons which went beyond any usefulness it might have had for its possessor or others. It was a glorious emanation of inner worth, an infallible mark of greatness of soul, as one 18th century author put it, echoing Cicero. Its supreme theatre was war, conceived not just as a struggle for mastery, but as a trial of valour and skill. Roger Williams, a soldier in the Cologne War of 1583-88, did not think it absurd to run up and down under enemy fire, clad in a great golden helmet with a plume of feathers. Commanders led from the front, rather than sheltering prudently in the rear. Even monarchs might lead their troops into battle. George II fought at Dettingen in 1743. Frederick the Great headed all of his many campaigns, narrowly escaping death on several occasions. George and Frederick were the last of their kind, however. The military revolution, so-called military revolution of the 17th century, had ushered in a style of combat in which tactical expediency set strict limits to personal bravado. At its core was the countermarch, a technique for sustaining a musket volley of up to 9 rounds a minute. Maurice of Nassau, a pioneer of this technique, describes it as follows in a letter of 1594. "I have discovered a method of getting the musketeers and soldiers armed with arquebuses, not only to keep firing very well, but to do it effectively in battle order, in the following manner. As soon as the first rank has fired together, then, by the drill they have learnt, they will march to the back. The second rank, either marching forwards or standing still, will next fire together, and then march to the back. After that, the third and following ranks will do the same. Thus, before the last ranks have fired, the first will have reloaded." Needless to say, Maurice's system depended on the strictest discipline. Everyone had to do just what he was told at just the right moment, or the whole intricately interlocking mechanism would fall apart. No room here for a Roger Williams. Only in the cavalry, an aristocratic preserve, could the old heroic virtue still be exercised within bounds. But the cavalry was no longer a match for well-drilled foot soldiers. Its new reduced role was to cut down troops already disorganized by musket or artillery fire. Decisive breakthroughs were beyond it, as Ney's disastrous charge at Waterloo made plain. Some writers, nostalgic for the days of chivalry, saw the arrival of firearms as spelling the demise of courage as such. All men's abilities are so levelled by gunshot that a dwarf may do his heroic feats of arms that way as a giant, wrote the 17th century satirist Samuel Butler. Dr. Johnson proposed the creation of an army of women, less as a tribute to female courage than as a mordant comment on the qualities required of a modern soldier. Strength is of less importance since firearms have been used, blows of the hand are now seldom exchanged, and what is there to be done in the charge or the retreat beyond the powers of a sprightly maiden? Of course, Butler and Johnson were joking. To execute, under enemy fire, evolutions of the sort outlined by Maurice of Nassau took courage. no doubt. But it was a different kind of courage to that demanded of warriors of an earlier epoch. Skill and audacity formed no part of it. Its essential point was obedience to orders in the cannon's mouth. Courage of this sort was neither a natural gift nor an ethical attainment. It was a product of discipline, meaning, for the rank and file, incessant drilling and beating, and for the officer class, a long and arduous schooling in the dead languages, also accompanied by incessant beating. Regimental uniforms gave visible expression to the new spirit of submission. The red coat, that latterly glamorous item of attire, was in its original meaning a servile livery, marking its wearer out as a king's man. The military revolution transformed the style of command as well. Alexander's men obeyed him because they admired him, and they admired him because he took upon himself all the risks he imposed on them, and more. But in the modern army, a commander expects to be obeyed simply because he is a commander. Daring is a redundant virtue in him. It may even be a liability, insofar as it leads him to risk his life for no good reason. Napoleon always stayed well back from the line of fire. Wellington got in closer, but only for tactical reasons. He needed to be near the action to know what was going on. The subsequent invention of the telegraph made it possible for generals to oversee battles from afar, while improvements in rifle and artillery technology made it all the more prudent for them to do so. Ulysses S. Grant never went near the front if he could help it. By the time of the Great War, the top brass were at least 50 miles back from the line of action. The lives they squandered so freely were not their own. And so among every rank, craving for personal honor was firmly subordinated to the requirements of national greatness. Courage meant courage to do one's duty, a word which more than any other enshrined the new ethos. All Victorian schoolchildren knew by heart the ringing lines. England expects that every man will do his duty. The path of duty was the way to glory. Note duty in the singular, a form which gained prevalence in this period over the duties favored by Georgian preachers and moralists. If duties were inherent to particular stations and situations, duty sounded from out of the blue, abstract and imperious. Brave, generous, affectionate, even unto death, loyal to duty, runs the epitaph of Commander Henry Robinson, who died in service in 1872. Philosophers trace the morality of duty to Kant, but in Britain, at any rate, it seems to me that it owed more to Wellington and Nelson. So look, there's much more to say, but I'm approaching the end of my time. I just want to highlight 2 points. By the end of the 19th century, courage, in the traditional physical sense, was largely confined to the army. For the civilian population, moral courage, plus resilience in the face of illness, was all that was expected, or indeed possible. And secondly, even within the army, physical courage was no longer the supreme intrinsic good it had once been taken to be, but simply one resource among others, which could be manufactured to order by special training and indoctrination. Henceforth, nations could dispense with the general cultivation of courage, vital to ancient cities. Vigor within the army could coexist with a salutary softness among the population at large, meaning that wealth was no longer the impediment to national greatness it had once appeared. Indeed, it was the chief source of greatness, insofar as it supplied the revenues on which professional armies themselves depended. Machiavelli was wrong after all. Money, not men, was the real sinews of war. For money gave strength to arms, which in turn brought in money. The closed circle of antiquity had become a helix, spiraling gloriously into infinity. So many questions remain. Can we really alienate our power of defense to Leviathan and remain free? Many have doubted it. And even if we can, will we ever be fully satisfied with the various ersatz forms of courage that remain open to us? Don't we half yearn for that infallible mark of greatness of soul, which only physical combat can, as we suppose, provide us with? And isn't this yearning the source of those strange paroxysms of military romanticism to which otherwise pacific nations are prone, including recently in relation to Ukraine? I leave these questions to the discussion.
Can I comment from here?
If you want.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that when I researched about you online, I saw that you're an avid ping pong player. So I hope you take my comments in that spirit, and I hope it will open up some questions, perhaps to the floor and perhaps in general. So, in his well-researched, erudite, and truly original paper, which I now learned is a part of a more ambitious project on the history of virtues, Professor Skidelsky offers us a conceptual, even longue-durée history of courage. The central aim of the paper is one with which I can identify to a great extent, namely, to utilize history in order to deepen our understanding of this elusive concept and to deploy history in order to challenge the ahistorical perspective undertaken by analytic philosophy. I, too, find this approach of turning to history to illuminate age-old philosophical questions as commendable and indeed invaluable. What is more, I find the choice of the topic to be very timely indeed, and I applaud you for not shying away from addressing such a capacious and challenging topic today. As for the argument itself, Skidelsky distinguishes between two models of ancient courage, two ideal types, I'm even tempted to say. The first is active courage, which was celebrated in the ancient world and is tied to daring self-assertion. And it was exemplified by the likes of Alexander the Great and Achilles. The other model of courage is a passive one, which is tied to endurance, and which Skidelsky associates with Socrates and later with Christ. Now, after setting the stage, Skidelsky leaps into late medieval Italy, or the early Renaissance, to trace how courage has gradually shifted from one pole to the other, how active aristocratic courage was sidelined in modern society, ultimately relegated to the sphere of war, and was subsequently replaced by a kind of passive courage that is tied to morality. What is more, as Skidelsky rightly argues, battlefield valor too gradually became outdated with the development of modern warfare and with the rise of modern armies and their growing reliance on uniformity of action and discipline. In this, the ancient aristocratic concept of individual courage, which was tied to honor and virtue, gradually faded, and courage became increasingly tied to utility. And I quote, "Public utility was displacing personal greatness as the touchstone of moral worth." End of quote. And I will return to this notion of touchstone because I believe it's very important to what is at stake. So the historical vista that your analysis opens to us in your paper portrays a radical modern shift that originated 5 centuries ago in early modern history of Europe, in which the meaning of courage was radically transformed, whilst violence itself became increasingly marginalized and sidelined from our daily life. By reading modernity in such terms, your argument evokes key works in this tradition, such as Norbert Elias's The Civilizing Process, Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and, more recently, Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature. I have 2 substantive comments that I would like to make. The first is more trivial, so I shall begin with it. It involves your usage of Machiavelli as a pivotal figure in this story. It seems to me that your reading of Machiavelli's analysis of virtue, or virtu, strictly in terms of courage, is somewhat deflationary and ignores the broader meaning this term entails in Machiavelli's thought, which goes back to Greek arete, or virtue writ large. I am reminded in the sense of Quentin Skinner's analysis of the term, but I'm also interested in the way that this concept of virtu operated within the early modern discourse of raison d'etat, or emerging raison d'etat, because I think now, and this leads to the second comment that I have to make, I think I'm interested in the way that it's tied to a form of validity, something that is shared and perhaps remained intact from antiquity to the present. So this leads me to my second and more pressing comment about the question of validity and the relationship between courage, rationality, and truth. A certain validity. Courage in the name of what? For what sake? Is the picture that you portray to us truly all that is left of courage, or I would even argue the notion of courage that Greek antiquity had in mind? And I would like to suggest that this level is absolutely integral to the story that you are telling. And this historical narrative that you essentially sketch out is one which could also be read in terms of a gradual process of rationalization, right? So as a Foucault scholar, I found your analysis of the rise of modern disciplinary power and the transformation of warfare entirely compelling. This genealogy maps out perfectly onto Foucault's own genealogical analysis of modernity, which was basically analyzed in Discipline and Punish in terms of substitution of brute force and its transformation into disciplinary power, and with it what he termed the modern creation of docile bodies. Admittedly, I was somewhat surprised not to see any reference to his work in your analysis, but the reason why I'm mentioning Foucault in this context is not because I think he has to appear as a footnote in your analysis, but because despite the various similarities between your analysis and Foucault's, Foucault fundamentally differs from you precisely on the question of courage, and he offers an analysis that challenges your main argument to a great degree. He does so by defining a form of courage which is altogether missing from your analysis, and which, I believe, problematizes your juxtaposition of the two ancient models of courage, and with it also the historical analysis that ensues. Foucault, who is renowned, or perhaps infamously renowned, for being a thinker of historical discontinuity, of ruptures and breaks, also viewed modernity in terms of fundamental shift. Curiously, however, on the topic of courage, Foucault claimed a rather consistent reading of it from antiquity to the present. The final lecture that Michel Foucault taught at the Collège de France before his untimely death in 1984 was dedicated to the theme of the courage of the truth, which, perhaps surprisingly, he read as a constant theme that runs through Western history from antiquity to the present and is very much to do with a certain form of validity that was discovered by Western philosophy. So, his analysis of this sort of courage, he claims, even if it has been marginalized or forgotten at times, is something that we still can learn by returning to the ancient Greeks. This form of courageous truth-telling, Foucault first located in Greek antiquity and is inherently tied to his own critical historical method and his own personal ideal as an intellectual. This kind of courage of truth, or courage for the sake of truth, Foucault locates in the Greek word paresia, which is often translated today as frank speech. Now, this meaning also has a public one that is still immobilized in the meaning in the meaning that it has, for instance, in my native language, which paresia means speak publicly. The word, Foucault claims, has a built-in social, political, and public dimension, and as such, it also entails an element of risk that is tied to speaking freely and frankly. What is more important, Foucault's analysis of paresia in terms of courage draws on exactly the same ancient text that you refer to in the chapter that I received. So, for instance, Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he characterizes precisely paresia in terms of megalopsychia, as a greatness of soul. And what is, I think, I mean, you didn't refer to it right now, but your analysis in the chapter draws on Plato's dialogue, Laches, in which is a dialogue on courage. Now, Foucault does exactly the same thing, but whereas you read it in terms of like an embodiment of ancient courage, the way that you define, Foucault has a very different reading of it. So I thought I might analyze it a little bit, because perhaps you can benefit from it. So this brings us again to the question of validity. Your analysis of courage in antiquity seems to me to underplay somewhat the epistemological rupture of Socrates cum Plato and Aristotle, which, to use Foucault's term, is ultimately the submission of truth to logos. Logos, after Plato, will become the touchstone against which the truth will be measured and which has a universal, transcendent validity. And this element was indeed carried over into Christianity, as you mentioned in your chapter. It is precisely this shared and universal aspect that Socrates plays against ancient aristocratic sophism, which carries combat, as it were, into public discourse, that I would like to emphasize. For instance, when you refer to duels, I think it's important to remember that the practice of trial by combat has remained with us until the late Middle Ages. And the trial by combat had nothing to do with honor or dignity. It was essentially a process that was meant to decide who has the truth. After that's why it's trial by combat. The winning side, we now discover, had the truth all along with them. Now, this is precisely, I think, what Socrates is trying to avoid by alluding to a higher touchstone, a higher authority, and that is reason. Now, Plato's dialogue itself does not merely discuss what courage is. It rather sets out the condition of possibility of being able to speak about courage. The dialogue first asks, what is the truth of courage? And it ties it to a certain courage that is of the truth and that is connected to the possibility of speaking the truth. This is what parousia is, this ideal of truth-telling. To wit, that in order to speak frankly and publicly, one requires a certain courage that implicates the person who speaks it. And it also entails a relation to power which commits the speaker and therefore also requires courage. The participants in this Platonic dialogue are mostly powerful Athenian men who willingly enter a game of truth, and in the beginning they make a pact in which they agree to speak the truth, and this means to commit to logos. They knowingly accept the risk that is entailed by a dialogue with Socrates. They know who Socrates is, and they know they might be humiliated and lose face in this process, but also that they might actually discover that they don't know what they were talking about, and yet they commit to this risk and embrace it almost. Now, Foucault defines parousia, as he takes it from this dialogue, in the following way, and I quote, "Parousia is not a skill. It is something which is harder to define. It is a stance, a way of being which is akin to virtue, a mode of action," end quote. So we can see that, first of all, parousia is not something that could be taught by the sophist, a knowledge, an arete. It is not a skill. It is something that, as it were, is already found within us. So this definition of parousia as a type of courage fundamentally challenges, I think, your two models of ancient courage, and also your reading of Socratic courage in terms of endurance, which is distinguished from the active model of daring assertion. It misses out on this third form of courage, which is precisely all about taking a risk and to make daring assertions, albeit in discourse, not in the battlefield. And this, to make daring assertions in political and philosophical discourse, is precisely what Socrates did. And he actively risked his life with his parousiastic truth-telling. He didn't merely endure the price that he was made to pay for the risk he knowingly took in the name of the truth. So, far from claiming that parousia remained a historical constant in the history of the West, Foucault also, similar to your analysis, traces the various historical displacements and eventual marginalization of parousia in modernity. He goes through the transformation of parousia in ancient Stoicism, the Christian practice of confession, medieval monastic preaching, as well as another late medieval invention, the university, which Foucault claims was a parousiastic, truth-telling, and risk-taking institution par excellence, which is to remind us that there is more to that period than merely Machiavelli writing about, indeed, combat and warfare, but there's also an entire game of reason that contests power and that is taking place beyond the reason of state. Figures like Giordano Bruno, Galileo Galilei, but also Martin Luther, are in this sense parousiastic too, right? When Luther is speaking before the Diet of Worms and he says, "Here I stand, I can do no other," he does it in the name of what he believes to be the truth as such, something that compels him to speak, but in the name of a higher authority. The risk each took by speaking the truth to power certainly entailed the risk of bodily injury and of death, and they were willing to take this risk for the sake of what they considered to be a universal and incontestable truth. This kind of courage has been an integral part of modern revolution, too. This leads me to another side question. I would like to hear more about what is the role of courage and risk-taking that we see and find in modern revolutionary discourse. And with this in mind, also how, of course, because the notion of modern revolution also introduced total war to a great extent, which in itself erases the lines between the front and the home front and between professional armies and civilians. So how this notion fits into the story, because we see a very clear example of it today in the Ukraine. But to return to the question of validity, I would like to focus on something that you said when you portrayed Kantian duty as, and especially the notion of autonomy, as merely obedience to a law that one gives to oneself. This formulation ignores the universal basis on which Kant's entire moral theory rests. It is rather an obedience to a law that one gives to oneself according to the universal principle of reason. That is, a law that is in accordance with the categorical imperative, which can be universalizable and shared by all rational creatures, be they human or not. Kant may have immanentized Socratic logos, but he nevertheless retained its universal validity. I am referring to this because I take this omission of this as, courage in the name of what? This omission of truth and validity that appears also in your analysis of Kant to be a strategic choice partly. It's tied to, I think, what you try to do in your argument by playing, as it were, ancient virtue ethics against modern utilitarianism. But you ultimately remain silent on the way that courage might act in a deontological setting, and this is another sort of moral avenue that I think we should, retain in the analysis of courage. So what is at stake, I think, what Kant reminds us, is the ability and the necessity to being able to make critical judgments about the present, and this critique must always rely on some universal a priori principle, which is to say that I entirely agree with you that we currently face a historical moment in which competing notions of duty often detract us from making the right judgments. Likewise, I also agree with you that to speak in favor of trans people in the UK in 2021 is not courageous. However, this statement is entirely context-dependent, as parousia. This is precisely what gives it its courageous dimension, namely that there is absolutely no risk whatsoever to utter this statement, first of all, in the UK, secondly, in 2021, and thirdly, over the pages of The Guardian. But it is very much courageous, and in this sense, this is how this speech act of parousia becomes activated. It is incredibly parousiastic if spoken in 2021 in Poland or Russia or Iran. And let us not forget, nor sacrifice, the basic moral commitment that speaking for trans people has independently of a given context. Because this is what is at stake, right? An ability to make judgment and moral judgments. So to sum up, I entirely share with you your concern regarding the prospects of being courageous today. And I'm also convinced that a historical critique of courage is very much needed. But I see the moral ambiguity of today as something that has to do more with the transformation of truth over the past 50 years than to do with the transformation of courage. It seems to me that it has to do more with people giving up on the idea of capital T truth as the touchstone for duty. Which means that if we look 50 years ago, we see, I think, two interesting developments. First of all, in the terms of war, I think that at least in Europe, war has become, from the standard to rather the exception. Before, and we can speak of peace as moments or intervals between war. For people who basically were, born post-70, war has become the exception, not the standard. Another thing that emerges is of course, identity politics, precisely out of what I see as the demise of a universal arbitration, a universal philosophy. And this means that we have conflicting duties. Who am I to speak in the name of what duty? Is it my gender, my race, my dietary moral preferences, in the name of my political affiliation? These duties are conflicting, and this is a part of the problem. So I think that if we would like to think about it in a productive way, I would like to, with your permission, to pick up the gauntlet of the Ukraine with which you concluded your talk, because I think that it is helpful to be reminded of what parousia means as a courage to speak truth to power, as something that emerged perhaps in Greek antiquity, but is still very much with us, I would argue, in similar shape and form. So first of all, Foucault's own analysis of this concept was initially inspired by the Soviet and other Eastern Bloc dissidents who risked their lives in order to convey the truth to the West of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. And in doing so, they didn't merely describe, they intervened in this politically, right? It was an integral part of the I would say, the revolutions that then ensued in that part of the world. So to me, one of the most puzzling things today is precisely the dearth in Russian voices who speak truth to power, whether in Russia or outside of it. This has less, it seems to me, to do with courage as such, and with the two models of courage you highlight in your thought-provoking paper. Military valor is certainly a part of this war and is presumably being practiced on both sides of the conflict. I myself, I was in the military, and the ethical code of the army of which I was a part, the first value is courage. I mean, this still appears there as something to obviously, something to follow. But the problem, I mean, if we look at this idea of military valor as this form of active kind of courage that has stayed with us, is precisely because this part of valor belongs to two sides equally. After the dust of the war will have settled, commendations will be given to brave Russian soldiers as much as to the Ukrainian, which is precisely, I think, the best proof why it doesn't teach us much about morality. Likewise,
may I ask, a while ago I heard the word to sum up.
Yeah, I'm getting to the end. As for the utilitarian model, as you rightfully suggest, is also of little help. In this I refer, I think, more to what you wrote in your chapter, because we can make the paradoxical statement that if we argue from utility, we can somehow render the actions of ordinary Russians who endure in silence as courageous moral actions. However, when it comes to the level of parousia, and I think this is what is unique about it, it doesn't fall on both sides. It falls just on one side. Precisely because it is context-dependent, it is absolute in its unflinching commitment to truth and to reality. And the truth of his war is simple and clear-cut. It is entirely unjustifiable, and it's morally repugnant. The contextual basis and risk that parousiastic courage entails mean that this should be, by and large, spoken by Russians, and preferably within Russia. Truth-telling is not merely descriptive, it is always performative and prescriptive. It is action through words. So, what is required today, now perhaps more than ever, is to remind ourselves that to speak the truth entails courage that is ultimately of its own. It's a certain courage that commits itself to speaking the truth, and which is intimately tied to the possibility of making correct judgments about our shared reality. In other words, to call things as they are and to follow the child from Hans Christian Andersen's tale and simply state that the emperor, in this case the emperor of Russia, is simply wearing no clothes. So again, I would like to commend you again for this rich and thought-provoking paper that touches what I think is an extremely important topic, especially today, and I hope you will find my suggestion and my proposal to focus on this perhaps hidden form of courage that is missing from your paper useful as you turn this topic into the book it deserves. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aner, for taking this role as the commentator up so passionately as you did. That was very nice. And it's a good habit, Edward, that you should first have the possibility to react on this. Please.
Okay, well, I'll be brief so we can leave time for other questions from the floor. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that the courage to speak the truth has been a constant theme from the time of Socrates onwards, and still is. And of course, that's also central to Christian martyrdom. Yeah, I mean, martyrs are literally witnesses to the truth. But I think there is a difference, nonetheless, between that and the modern notion of moral courage. You see, because moral courage is defined not so much by its motive as by the kinds of risks that you face. I mean, moral here is being used in the old-fashioned sense, non-physical, rather than, to do with morality. So, moral courage is the kind of courage that faces fear of social disapproval rather than, actual death. Yeah, and I think it's central to all ancient notions of courage that the risk you're facing is death. Yeah, And that was certainly the risk that Socrates, faced, and I mean, all truth tellers in ancient Greece, faced, execution. I mean, it was the penalties they faced were physical, not just moral. And I think that does mark a big difference between, the courage of Socrates and what we now think of as moral courage, which, where the penalties or the risks you face are, non-physical. Yeah. And at least, in our part of the world, I mean, not in other parts of the world. I think in Russia, certainly the risks you face are very much physical. But I would define that as physical courage.
That's what I tried to say, that this kind of courage is sort of doesn't fit exactly this active and passive. It's a form of active courage, not that different from the
But I think what happened in Western societies is, as they became more gentler and more pacific, more law governed, opportunities for physical courage were just not available to most people outside the army. So some substitute had to be found that would allow civilians to not to lose face, and that was moral courage. So I see it as essentially a face-saving device. And I think that's also the reason why we do remain tremendously sort of spellbound by instances of physical courage elsewhere in the world, such as in Russia and the Ukraine, because some obscure part of us recognizes that this is the real thing, and that we're not going to have opportunities to be tested in that way. So that would be my response.
Thanks, Edward, for trying to be brief in the response. Yes, please, Johannes.
So thank you. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your lecture, and also, of course, for the response. I have to say that I am quite convinced about the general sketch that you gave us of that switch from physical to moral courage. What I'm not entirely convinced by yet is whether the explanation that this is a face-saving device actually does explain that switch. It seems to be that one of the crucial developments, historically speaking, that is developing is quite simply modern mass democracy. The thinker for me to go to describe the centrality of moral courage in modern times would be Tocqueville, and his analysis of the dynamics that lead to what he called the tyranny of the majority, where it becomes incredibly difficult, and in modern ways newly difficult, to disagree with the majority and with majority opinion. And in that regard, the whole question of moral courage gets, I think, new urgency, and it becomes, in a sense, a new task of its own, not as an ersatz, but actually as a new problem.
Yeah.
And so that's basically my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. Yes, I think. Sort of mass opinion does sort of exert a pressure in the modern age that it never used to. So to stand against it requires more and more courage. I think just to pick up on your point, I think what's happened recently is that public opinion has fragmented into these, what George Orwell calls mutual admiration cliques. Now we call them opinion bubbles, don't we? And so, people, within these bubbles can claim courage for themselves because they're attacked by people in other bubbles who, you know, equally claim courage for themselves. So it's no longer that you know, you have a sort of monolithic public in the way perhaps you did in, you know, 19th century America. It's more that you have these rival publics, which perhaps changes the situation somewhat. But yeah, no, I think that's I take your point. That's
please.
Thank you for your lecture and also for elaborated comment. But I actually wanted to return somehow to the beginning, because you often spoke about courage as something belonging to action. But I wanted to ask about the interactive aspect of courage as something that takes place in the interaction, and what Aner underlined, that there is power that shapes the context of this interaction, and it's always power asymmetries. And then I wanted to ask you about the dialectics between victim and perpetrator, because there is like courage to inflict damage and courage to take damage, right? And how in this, how this interaction is precisely defined or is played out not only within the immediate context, but precisely within this transcendental context of truth or other meaning and value. And so how basically there is a traveling from courage of a perpetrator and thinking in terms of courage of victim. And again, it seems that it never disappeared, this thinking in these terms. And this brings me to a kind of a second question that I wanted to ask, because then it raises like, who experiences courage or who perceives courage? Because in the way you describe, you build this lineage of changing the welfare, the statehood, but then as if this dimension of emotive or even of reflexive recognition, as if it came automatically. But there is also the body that mediates what is perceived as courage, and whether you accounted for this huge shift in the subjectivity, in actually sensitivity that occurred from the 18th century, and how the very human being and his or her sensibilities were constructed or changed in this period, and how courage also acquired a new dimension. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I mean, just in response to the first, the courage of perpetrators and victims. I mean, clearly courage implies risk. Yeah. So if you're in a position of absolute power over someone else, I don't think you can be said to display courage. I mean, Himmler gave a notorious speech to the SS, and he urged them to show courage in suppressing their natural feelings of pity. Yeah, I mean, that was obviously a perversion of language. I mean, you can't talk about courage in that context. So, yeah, there has to be some sort of rough equality between the two parties to be able to talk of courage. If one has absolute power. Yeah, I mean, as long as there's some risk, then we can talk of courage. But I don't think we can talk of the courage of the torturer. And yeah, the second point. I mean, so yeah, I think you're saying, was this process? I'm talking about a sort of, should it be understood in a top-down way or a more bottom-up way? I think both. I mean, I think one's talking about something that at the one level takes place, in institutional terms, the growth of professional armies, modern bureaucracies, but it's also a process that takes place in the soul of individual citizens as they respond to these new structures. And so I think it has to be approached in both ways.
So I suggest we can take two more questions, comments. First was John Dunn. I don't know if anybody else. This is the last chance.
Thank you very much. It's very, very interesting and confusing subject, I suppose. and I don't have any clear sense of the boundaries of it. It's not the sort of subject I've thought about seriously, so I frankly have no idea how to think about it. But it occurred to me, starting off from your initial challenge, that maybe there's some force to thinking about it in a way which is very simple-minded, which is to say that whatever else is going to be true about the instantiation of courage as a concept, it's going to have to be true that its setting is in a question about how to live and how not to live, how to act and how not to act, how to, succeed at a moment as opposed to fail at a moment as a human being. Well, obviously, there are many different sorts of human beings, so the way you fail or succeed will depend on what sort of human being you happen to be at that time and place. That's bound to be so. But it seems to me there are a couple of things which are going to turn out to be true about courage for the concept to be a plausible translation across languages, because that must be the one way of tracking what you're looking for. It has to be the correct translation as you move between languages. Otherwise, you have lost any subject matter at all. That's the necessary structural constraint on what you're thinking about. And it seems to me that two things have to be true. First of all, it has to be true that there is danger, that you are facing danger. There's no danger, there's no opportunity for courage. Not just there's no need, there's no opportunity. There's no conceptual opportunity for it. And secondly, it has to be true that to display courage, you have to be facing down danger. So you have to have fear. If you just don't notice, if you just crash on regardless, that's not courage. That's just a defective perception, really. So I think there is a sort of, I mean, I'm not a philosopher, God help me, but there is a sort of conceptual core there, I think. And also there's a connection between the fact there's a conceptual core, that there's the possibility of translating across languages.
John, would you hand on the mic to James just behind me? Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, that's very helpful. Yes, I mean, when in my little sort of snipe at analytic philosophy at the beginning, I wasn't meaning to deny that there is a sort of a core notion of courage that allows us to translate between different words and different languages. And yes, I think it must have something to do with, perhaps not danger, because surely can't you display courage in relation to something you think is dangerous, isn't actually? I mean, the arachnophobe who goes into a room full of completely harmless spiders. So fear, I think, has to be... Yes. But you have to believe that there's danger, yes. And then, yes, you have to, in some way, face it or overcome it. I agree. That's got to be core to any notion of courage. But then I think, and that's really minimal. And then the concept is developed in a lot of different ways. And I think it's, what's unrealistic is to, try to, some analytic philosophers have tried to do, to sort of put further, more specific conditions on what courage really is. I think, that's just a hopeless enterprise, because our intuitions are the product of this long history, and they're very divided, and it's impossible to sort of find some coherent theory that will accommodate them all, and I think that's true not just of courage but of moral concepts more generally, and it's just the project of my book is to show that.
James.
So I'd also like to thank you for a very rich talk. I guess the question I had, there's one aspect that was strangely missing from your account, because you're so much interested in sort of the evolution of military history and experiences on these matters, and is the relationship which is often debated between the experience of hoplite warfare and the polis. And there you have, I mean, for example, there's examples in, texts like from a Xenophon, Book 5 of Plato's Republic, and there that experience of the peculiar kind of cooperation of facing danger and risk inter arma, which is clearly identified with courage, is seen to have a metaphorical value, or at least some kind of political valence. So the very language of hoplite warfare is incorporated within Greek political culture, where, of course, the danger isn't always facing death, even if though it might in many of the decisions that the polis makes. Death might be something that is risked. But nevertheless, that it has, again, a kind of, it's a kind of metaphorical value is what I kind of wanted to push towards. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. So in other words, something like a transition from the martial notion of courage to the moral, in the sense of political, might already be orchestrated within Greek thinking or the Greek experience of political life, maybe in a different way than what you reconstruct happens later. And there might be an interesting contrast between the two.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, I do discuss this in an earlier section of the chapter, which I didn't read out on the lackeys, because lackeys' paradigm of courage is the hoplite soldier who defends his ground, right? And then Socrates, generalizes from this to say that courage is an endurance of the soul. So the hoplite soldier becomes a model of the courage of endurance, as distinct from the courage of attack. And then Socrates broadens this to include, courage in politics and in the face of illness and so forth. Perhaps that particular style of warfare did encourage a particular way of thinking about courage as a defensive rather than aggressive. It's very different from the kind of courage you need to lead a cavalry charge, let's say, isn't it? It's I take that point.
If I may just add about this question, one thing. I think that this is a very good question, but there's also another element, I think, of courage that we tend to forget, and actually the Greeks speak of it at that time, and that sort of is the courage of spies, those who are solitary, going to the enemy territory in order to scout and see what's happening. And this is a term that often, repeatedly comes again in the analysis of cynicism, the cynics of Greek philosophy, who, as it were, they go before the people. And they also take an active risk. So I think, this is an...
What I was pointing to, it's hoplite warfare is a collective experience. And so the idea the idea that the difference is removed from an individual courage, so Alexander was cited. Of course, the irony there is that he relied on phalanx warfare quite powerfully, but that's a collective experience. And the idea that it was only Alexander who was exhibiting courage and not the soldiers with the sarissas, who had to fight, as it were, in even more mechanical way than the hoplite forebears. That collective experience of courage as a primal virtue, that leads to a certain style of political thinking. So it's not the individual courage at all. It's something that is the courage that we share, facing a common risk and a common enemy.
Edward, I'll keep all my questions for a later opportunity. Thank you so much, but I think I would not want to miss the opportunity to ask you about something that I said at the very beginning, very briefly maybe. Can you tell us about this project that I find quite fascinating, which is very much related to the topic of your talk today, The Virtues of the Dead?
Yeah, okay.
Collecting epitaphs. Can you tell us a few sentences about that?
Yeah, so this is a project that grew out of this book originally. So I'm writing a book on the language of the virtues. One chapter is on courage, but there are also chapters on justice, charity, chastity, and so forth, showing how these concepts have evolved over time. And I realized that one of the best sources of evidence for this was tombstone epitaphs. I don't know if this is a thing in Austria, but in England, if you go to any parish church, you'll see little plaques with inscriptions on them saying, Joe Bloggs, combined the suavity of a gentleman with the humility of a Christian. These very formulaic and no doubt dishonest phrases. They're everywhere, but they're very telling of what people thought it appropriate to say about someone who just died. So what I've done is I've gone around photographing these. I've got over 1,000 now, and I've created a website where you can search them under particular virtue terms. So if you want to know, how the word charity or benevolence or courage was used, you can just type in that search term, and all the mentions of it will come up, sorted by decade. So you can notice correlations and shifts over time. So it's a tool for doing conceptual history. That's
Thank you. I just found this quite an interesting project in also moral history and.
I invite you all to look at it. It's if you type in virtues of the dead into Google, it will come up.
Thanks, Albert. So thank you to all of you very much for joining us today. And most of all, thanks to Aner for his great comment of the talk today, and to you, Edward, for being with us tonight and giving this talk. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Thank you.